The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has recently issued a detailed report unraveling an aerial military standoff on May 26 over the South China Sea. Released video footage shows a Chinese J-16 fighter jet obstructing the flight path of an American RC-135V electronic reconnaissance aircraft, compelling the U.S. pilot to traverse through the turbulent wake of the J-16. Flight data substantiate that the American reconnaissance flight path skirted Chinese territorial waters at its closest, only 50 kilometers off the Huilai County, Jieyang City, China, albeit entirely over international waters. On May 31st, the Southern Theater Command of China claimed in a statement that the Shandong aircraft carrier group was conducting routine training in the South China Sea at the time and accused the U.S. RC-135 of intentionally intruding into the training zone. It was then placed under continuous aerial tracking by the People's Liberation Army. Although it appears that the U.S. was at a disadvantage in this encounter, some military observers suggest that this may have been a deliberate, systemic monitoring of China's Shandong aircraft carrier by the U.S., revealing potential problems with the carrier and highlighting the Taiwan Strait as a potential weakness for the Chinese Communist Party. Subsequently, with the Shandong heading north to Dalian, there may no longer be any other carriers available for the Chinese government. The Shandong's formation in the South China Sea was notably lacking in aerial and submarine protection, with only 2 frigates as escort. This apparent military tactical error gave the U.S. an opportunity to dispatch the RC-135V for continuous tracking and signal detection of the carrier group. The Chinese military, possibly aware that many of its electronic secrets may have fallen into U.S. hands, dispatched a J-16 fighter jet from a terrestrial airfield in an attempt to intercept the U.S. reconnaissance aircraft. Amidst this event, the Chinese government insists that the Shandong aircraft carrier was engaged in training and that the U.S. RC-135 was interfering with its operations. This reveals the PLA's failure to declare a maritime exclusion zone for the exercise, raising questions as to whether the Shandong was traversing international waters or indeed in training. According to international law, if there is no maritime exclusion declaration, civilian or military vessels and aircraft from other nations have the right to freely pass through the area. Considering the importance of the Shandong carrier, any training activity should be considered an exercise, with appropriate maritime closures put in place to prevent foreign reconnaissance aircraft from approaching. As such, this so-called training may well have been an excuse from the Chinese government for their own negligence regarding the Shandong and an attempt to shift the blame to the Americans. Furthermore, if the Shandong was indeed in training, then J-15 fighters from the carrier should have been immediately scrambled to intercept and possibly drive away any approaching reconnaissance aircraft. However, there was no sign of J-15s being deployed, with the PLA instead deploying a J-16 from the Southern Theater Command to intercept. This glaring omission has led to serious questions about the PLA's capabilities in the South China Sea, leaving their strategic ambitions for regional dominance unrealized. Given the Chinese government's failure to provide detailed information, speculation is rife that the Shandong may not have been carrying J-15 fighter jets at all. Hence, when the U.S. reconnaissance aircraft was detected, the Chinese could only watch helplessly as it took photographs and collected information. This possibility is extremely embarrassing, likely prompting the aggressive actions of the J-16 pilot. Facing a non-threatening U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, Chinese fighter pilots might be compelled to overreact, leading to a dangerous standoff between Chinese and American forces. The incident also seems to imply that the Shandong was not conducting substantial training, but was instead advancing towards the Taiwan Strait from the South China Sea, escorted by 2 frigates. This conjecture was confirmed on the afternoon of May 27th, when the Shandong, traveling from south to north, traversed the Taiwan Strait. Senior commentators point out that despite the US publicly sharing video footage that exposes unprofessional maneuvers by the Chinese military, the Chinese government continues to assert that their pilots' actions were professional, twisting the facts to absolve themselves. One reason for this behavior, according to analysts, is the need for the Chinese Communist Party to propagate internally. As the majority of the Chinese public cannot access US released footage and only receive information from the Chinese government, the incident is being used to stoke nationalist sentiments among certain sections of the populace. Another seasoned US-based commentator, Wang He, also weighed in on the matter. He posits that the Chinese government is currently facing internal and external pressures, with President Xi Jinping's internal political situation precarious and internal stability lacking. Consequently, they might be exaggerating international tensions in the public eye, occasionally even provoking incidents intentionally so as to divert attention from domestic issues and unify the external front by leveraging international pressure. Wang He further elaborated in his analysis, stating that there's a significant military power disparity between China and the US. The Chinese government feels that the extensive reconnaissance activities conducted by the US in the nearby seas on an annual basis pose a significant pressure on them, as it is possible the US already has an in-depth understanding of China's coastal military situation. Consequently, the Chinese government has adopted a head-on strategy which could also be seen as a sort of rogue tactic. Citing an anonymous senior US military official, Radio France reported that there has been an astonishing increase in the number of reckless aerial interceptions and naval standoffs by Chinese planes and vessels. The US does not regard these interceptions as individual actions of the pilots, but rather as a more widespread, recurring pattern. A few days before the incident on the 27th, a typhoon was forming around Guam, posing a significant threat to the relatively small Shandong carrier. Being caught in a typhoon could break the steel plates of the ship, leaving the Shandong with no choice but to head north quickly to escape the storm. With the wind blowing from south to north, even if there were aircraft carried on the Shandong, they would not have been able to take off. Associate researcher Huang Chongting from the Taiwan Institute of Defense and Security Research provided further explanation on the details of the entire incident. He described how the Shandong, accompanied by 2 frigates, traveled north quietly on the mainland side of the Taiwan Strait. While the Chinese military claimed that traversing the Taiwan Strait was a routine activity, Taiwanese media noticed a few issues. Huang explained that an aircraft carrier passing through the Taiwan Strait is an unusual action. The average depth of the Taiwan Strait is about 60 meters, which is not conducive for submarine activities, implying that the Shandong didn't have the protection of submarines while it traversed the strait. Furthermore, with the average width of the Taiwan Strait being 180 kilometers, the Shandong's passage was within the range of Taiwan's shore-based anti-ship weapons. From a tactical perspective, this is highly unusual. Aircraft carriers, as airfields for carrier-based aircraft, should be at least 500 kilometers away from shore-based anti-ship missiles. Huang emphasized that this operation appeared more like a situation where the Chinese military placed the Shandong within Taiwan's attack range rather than a demonstration of force. He believed that this form of deterrence was tactically ridiculous and revealed that the crossing of the Taiwan Strait was more of a helpless move by the Chinese Navy. It was reported that since the Shandong traversed the Taiwan Strait escorted by 2 warships and headed north on May 27th, neither Japan nor Taiwan have released any more information about the Shandong. It is speculated that the Shandong did not carry out circumnavigation training, but instead headed to Dalian shipyard. Chinese military experts claimed in the Global Times that the Shandong's crossing of the Taiwan Strait has become routine. This routine is believed to be actual trips to the Dalian shipyard for maintenance. Currently, there are 2 routes for the Shandong to return to the shipyard for maintenance, either going north through the Taiwan Strait or going around the east of Taiwan. If the latter is chosen, it would need to cross the Bashi Channel into the Philippine Sea, then head north through the Miyako Strait into the East China Sea before heading to Dalian shipyard. This route is longer and further from the Chinese coastline, requiring a complete fleet escort, possibly even accompanied by a replenishment ship. A carrier-based aircraft is also necessary. Otherwise, the empty ship sailing in the Philippine Sea could be a potential embarrassment in the presence of US and Japanese aircraft or warships. Should the Shandong choose to navigate around Taiwan, all of the roughly 5,000 crew members must accompany the journey. Otherwise, the aircraft carrier cannot function in full capacity. The home base of these 5,000 crew members is in Hainan, within the Southern Theater Command. On reaching Dalian, accommodation and training logistics for these personnel are not trivial matters. During the maintenance period of the aircraft carrier, the Northern Theater Command can't support them indefinitely, possibly necessitating sending these personnel back to Hainan. Once the maintenance is complete, they would again need to travel from Hainan to Dalian. Apart from the back and forth travel of these 5,000 individuals, the J-15 carrier-based aircraft and pilots of the Shandong also belong to the Southern Theater Command. Upon arrival at Dalian, they will need to fly back to the Southern Theater Command, possibly refueling once or twice in the Eastern or Central Theater Command. When the carrier maintenance is completed, these J-15s would need to fly back to Dalian. The escort fleet would also need to return to Hainan and then head north once the carrier is repaired. The Chinese military cannot freely mobilize troops and deploy them to different theaters without directives from the Central Military Commission or Chinese President Xi Jinping. Otherwise, there may be suspicions of rebellion. Therefore, if the carrier goes around Taiwan from the east for maintenance in Dalian, it would entail such toing and froing. Therefore, for practicality, the best passageway for China's naval aircraft carriers is through the Taiwan Strait. Such maneuvers require fewer crew members, can forgo the need to carry aircraft, and sailing along the coast necessitates fewer resupplies and escort ships. However, this requires the Shandong carrier traversing the Taiwan Strait in a relatively disarmed state. Undoubtedly, should conflict break out in the Taiwan Strait, Chinese aircraft carriers and large warships would be compelled to take a detour via the Philippine Sea, severing the capacity for mutual support between China's North and South naval fleets. The Bashi and Miyako Straits could potentially be blocked by American and Allied forces, rendering the Chinese naval forces in the northern and southern theaters isolated and more susceptible to defeat. In this instance, the Shandong would be unable to return to Dalian for maintenance, necessitating anchorage in a South China Sea port. Chinese Eastern Theater naval bases, primarily located at Jieyang in Zhejiang and also at Shanghai, would likely keep their fleet at a distance to avoid the reach of Taiwan's shore-based anti-ship missiles. Therefore, any military move on Taiwan would pose a logistical conundrum for the movements of the aircraft carrier. The Taiwan Strait thus becomes a strategic quandary for the Chinese Navy, leading to a careful refrain from any reckless actions. The US forces are adamant to prevent any Chinese military takeover of Taiwan. A Chinese-held Taiwan would allow nuclear submarines to easily access the Pacific from the eastern shores of Taiwan, effectively turning the Taiwan Strait into an inland sea, thereby enabling free passage for the Chinese Navy from north to south, and even establishing bases in eastern Taiwan. In such a scenario, American naval vessels would be unable to traverse the Taiwan Strait nor pass through the Bashi Strait effortlessly. Movements in the South China Sea would be heavily constrained, hampering US global deployments and the freedom of navigation initiatives. Any Indo-Pacific commander would then face enormous pressure, with the primary task being the reclamation of Taiwan. In such situation, the Chinese leadership must carefully balance all factors to prevent a spiraling situation. Should a conflict in the South China Sea precede a potential Taiwan Strait crisis, the artificial islands and reefs in the South China Sea may be easily destroyed by American forces. Neighboring countries may secretly rejoice or even publicly support US actions, posing a severe challenge to China's position in the South China Sea. As an affirmation of these developments, the US has been consistently deploying reconnaissance aircraft for close surveillance in the South China Sea for a considerable length of time. In 2022 alone, over 600 US reconnaissance flights were recorded in this region. Various aircraft, including E-3 series, E-8C, RC-135 series, and P-8A, were dispatched to gather comprehensive multidimensional intelligence. Particularly, the RC-135V electronic reconnaissance aircraft stationed at Kadena Air Base has been tasked with strategic reconnaissance over Russia's Far East, Korean Peninsula, Yellow Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and South China Sea. This aircraft can gather key military data through electronic reconnaissance, which would directly aid in target selection and mission planning in the event of conflict. Yet, these maneuvers have not gone unchallenged. In February this year, a Chinese J-11 jet fighter equipped with 4 air-to-air missiles passed several hundred feet above a US Navy P-8A anti-submarine patrol aircraft, leading the US Indo-Pacific Command to state that the frequency of dangerous aerial intercepts by Chinese military aircraft is increasing alarmingly. Last May, Chinese military aircraft used chaff to disrupt an Australian reconnaissance aircraft over the South China Sea. Towards the end of last year, a Chinese J-11 fighter intercepted a US RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft at a startlingly close distance of only 3 meters. Then in February, another J-11 fighter intercepted a US P-8A reconnaissance aircraft near the Paracel Islands. Yet it appears that US reconnaissance activities have not diminished. Just in May of this year, the RC-135V conducted at least 7 operations in the surrounding waters. These activities, coupled with the forceful response from the Chinese military forces, have made the South China Sea a focal point for the military standoff between the US and China. In this standoff, China's naval forces have come under particular scrutiny, especially the status and actual combat capability of their aircraft carriers. Taking the Shandong, China's first domestically built aircraft carrier. As an example, it has evidently faced some operational and maintenance challenges since its commissioning in 2019. With multiple maintenance and repair periods throughout its short operational life, questions have been raised about its true readiness for combat. These concerns have further intensified the military tensions in the South China Sea region and have influenced evaluations of the Chinese Navy's strength. The carrier was officially commissioned in December 2019 in Shanya, Hainan. However, reports suggested it wasn't entirely completed at that time. In fact, it appears that the carrier was declared ready for service a year ahead of schedule due to political needs. 9 days after the delivery ceremony, the Shandong sailed back to the Dalian shipyard via the Taiwan Strait. It was not until December of the following year, after another trip to Hainan, that it was considered truly commissioned. However, in March 2022, the Shandong sailed back to Dalian for maintenance via the Taiwan Strait again. Afterwards, in April, the carrier underwent nearly half a month of long-distance training in the Philippine Sea before returning to its base in Hainan. Insights suggest that the PLA Navy's actual readiness with respect to its carriers might be overstated. With only a single long-distance training voyage lasting half a month and occasional appearances in nearby waters, the Shandong's actual time in combat-ready condition seems relatively brief. Currently, China's other carrier, the Liaoning, is under maintenance at the shipyard, while the new Fujian has yet to conduct genuine sea trials. Therefore, it seems that, at least for now, the PLA Navy may not have any available carriers.